Thanks everybody for coming. I'm just going to say like a brief few words to start us off and introduce myself and the context for the day. My name is Nathan O'Donnell. I'm one of the co-editors of Paper Visual Art Journal. This is an art journal that's been running for 10 years now, actually. It was founded in 2009 by Niamh Dunphy. Over the past couple of years, we've been producing thematic issues twice yearly. The latest, which we're launching today, is focused upon borders, the theme of borders and how borders interact with contemporary art, although we're also interested and we have contributions which look at borders in the ecological sense and that really take on questions about borders in other ways that I think are interesting and rich, and that's something that I hope will be reflected in what happens today. The latest issue on borders, which we're launching now, has been we've been thinking about it for some time. We had the obviously the chronology, the timing in mind about Brexit. We didn't quite realise that it was going to be still so topical and urgent on the 23rd of March. But what happened, we had been in discussion with Mary Cremen, the director of Void, for some time about running an event together. And yeah, when this idea for this issue came up, we spoke to Mary, and Mary was curating the exhibition that's on at the moment in the gallery, Open Ground, which is also focused on borders. So this felt like a very easy and natural fit. So yes, well, I suppose this will be the first of two symposia that we're organising. Grounded in this question about the border. And the second, so the first is happening at Void, and the second will happen at the National Gallery in Dublin in May. The way things will work, we're going to have presentations from the artists and writers involved, and then there'll be a kind of group discussion at the end. Yes, and afterwards we'll be launching the magazine. There'll be some refreshments in the gallery if people want to hang around and yeah, have a chat. And the last thing to say before I introduce the speakers is just to acknowledge the funding of the Arts Council of Ireland, without whom this wouldn't be possible. So we'll be beginning with Willie Doherty. Willie Doherty, since the 1980s, has been a pioneering figure in contemporary art, film and photography. At once highly seductive and visually disorientating, Doherty's artworks tend to begin as responses to specific terrains, most often mysterious isolated settings, places we suspect with a troubled past, and evolve as complex reflections on how we look at such locations, or what stories might be told about their hidden histories. So Willie will be speaking first. After Willie, we'll have Darran Anderson. Darran Anderson is the author of Imaginary Cities and the forthcoming Inventory. He has written on the intersection of urbanism with politics, culture and technology for the likes of The Atlantic, The Guardian, Wired, as well as art and photography for Frieze and Magnum. He's given talks at the Venice Biennale, the London School of Economics and the V&A, amongst others. He's based in London and grew up on the Derry-Donegal border. And finally, we'll have Siobhan McDonald speaking to finish the proceedings. Siobhan McDonald is an artist in residence in the School of Natural Sciences at Trinity College Dublin, working with world-leading research facilities such as the European Space Agency, NASA, the JRC European Commission and the European Research Council to explore ecology in light of current ecological concerns. She holds a Master's in Visual Arts Practice from IADT. In 2018, she received the Trinity Creative Challenge Award from Trinity College Dublin. In 2017, she received a bursary from the Arts Council of Ireland and was the recipient of a Creative Ireland Award and a Culture Ireland GB18 2018 award.
Thanks, Nathan. It's very nice to be here today. Thank you for the invitation, Mary, as part of this exhibition. So you probably pass on my photographs outside on the way in, and I'm sure some of you may have seen some of them before. I'm interested in the title of the talk, Fault Lines. I guess over a period of 40 years or something, it seems like, or around that amount of time. I've been looking at various fault lines, some connected with the border, but often trying to kind of reimagine or imagine this place where we are today, Derry, in different kinds of ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a series of works that were made probably from the mid-1980s up until a few months ago that look at the border or issues around the border or the ways in which various fault lines are expressed in the city of Derry. I mean, Derry is not just a border city, but it's a city that's divided by a river. It's a city that has got two names. It's a city where language is kind of central to an understanding of how the place functions. And in some ways that is kind of what this work is about. I mean, the other side is a kind of a throwaway expression here to talk about the side other than your own, or the other political persuasion or the other religious persuasion. But also it confuses both geographic and political space as well, this notion that west is south and east is north. So I mean, in some ways the work has its basis within photography, I guess. So I am interested in photography and the business of actually being in a place and at some level documenting the place. But I'm not actually that interested in documentary photography or the kind of practice of reportage. And in some ways this work has from the outset set itself apart from that or in parallel to it in some way. So I'm more interested in the gap between the difficulty of attempting to kind of document the place and all of the baggage that goes along with that in terms of truth and reliability and objectivity, and the idea of fiction, and how fiction, or the idea of telling stories, perhaps tells us more about the kind of reality of a place or a situation. So, and perhaps gives us some ways of thinking around particular contexts. So, by way of a brief introduction, that was, yeah. So this is a work from 1986. Again, just, you know, in a very simple way, a kind of juxtaposition of that at some level tries to unpick the kind of language that I think this phrase was attributed to Ian Paisley. You know, this notion of the blue skies of Ulster and the grey mists of an Irish Republic being these two kind of separate entities, not just political entities, but also, you know, what interests me is this goes to the heart of how these places are imagined and how identity is kind of imagined around that. Likewise, this work, I mean, made on the River Foyle in the same year. One image taken on the west bank of the river. The text in green there says "Chucky Arla, our day will come," which at that time was a Sinn Féin slogan that was used in their as part of their political campaigns or election campaigns. And this we will maintain on the east bank, you know, which is, yeah, expressing a desire for stability, for things not to change, for the status quo to be maintained in some way. You know, which, you know, is essentially a kind of mirror image of where we are today, perhaps as well. You know, and the bridge in Derry. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, another one of the fault lines in the city, how the bridge functions as a space that both connects the east bank and the west bank of the city, but also functions as a kind of a barrier in some ways, or a space of transition and a space of where there's a certain level of kind of anxiety, if you want. And the city walls, from around the same period, again, function in the same way. the historical position of the walls, overlooking the bogside, and how the walls, I suppose, resist attempts to neutralize them in a way, to make the walls just a kind of tourist attraction, or to try and make them function in a way that kind of denies their political and historical and symbolic potency in some way. So they continue to resist that, I think, And again, from 1985, a work that was, I think, one of the first works that I made that attempted to kind of look at the border and Derry's relationship with the border. And at that time, the photograph on the left is it's a photograph taken along the line, as Derry people call it, which is a former railway track that is now it's now become a cycle path, part of a cycle path, and so if you're walking along there these days, when you'll encounter people walking or cycling. When I made this photograph, it was, as you can see, it was pretty overgrown, and there was a path there, but the closer you got to the border, I mean, one of the things that I was concerned with at that time in my work was the presence of surveillance, and kind of covert surveillance, which for me had something to do with photography at that time and using a camera. So, I mean, I was quite uncomfortable when I was making this work through that period about using a camera, because I didn't want to be mistaken for a tourist, or I didn't want to be mistaken for a journalist, So I used to carry my camera in a plastic bag, and I would just take the camera out, take a photograph, and then put it back in the bag and move on, So all of these early photographs are all handheld. I never used a tripod. I just had a very simple 35mm SLR. So yeah, I mean, but for me it was about trying to, or my desire to get to places where you had the sense that you shouldn't be, that there was why would you be walking along the border? Why would you want to walk out the line and kind of cross the border? So the other panel on this is just where Letterkenny Road starts. And the trees on the left are, I guess, where the start of the railway track, where the other trees of the previous image start as well. So I'm going to show you a group of works now from 93, 94. I stopped making these black and white photographs with text in 1992, and I made I suppose a transitional body of work in 92, which were black and white photographs that didn't have text, and I think there's one of them in the gallery outside. And then I started working on the series of colour Cibachrome photographs, some of which you see outside. And I guess I used Cibachrome because I was kind of interested in this process, in this kind of very reflective, shiny paper that was originally produced for the advertising industry. It was used for display purposes, really, and came in two formats. One is the paper, the other is a film that was used for light boxes. But I kind of liked the kind of oversaturated colour and the kind of contrasty nature of it. So, and I was kind of interested in the connection with advertising that the paper was designed for, and making kind of images of Ireland. I mean, I guess at some point I was kind of thinking about the tourist board kind of images of Ireland, or that layer of kind of images of Ireland as this kind of unspoiled landscape in some way, particularly parts of the west and parts of the north as well. And trying to find out, how this body of work or how these images of kind of burnt out cars and stuff could fit within that in some way, that I could, and I suppose in a kind of ironic way, appropriate part of the mechanism of the advertising world or that language to produce these images. So I made a number of them along the border. And this was, I guess, in the period around the first IRA ceasefire. And yeah, so these were of cars that were used for some incident in Derry and then taken out to the border and burned. And they usually kind of hung around for a couple of days and then they were removed eventually, And these, and there's a couple of these concrete roadblocks blocking this little road as well. So around the same time, I actually made this this video work called "At the End of the Day." Okay, so this is a work that I made in 1994. Actually, just a week or two before these roadblocks were removed. So it was quite opportunistic, I think, on my part to shoot this little sequence of video.
We're all in this together.
So I'll just show you a little clip of that. I mean, it's essentially it's a repetition of the same little sequence with a different phrase at the end of it, which uses some of the language that was being used around that time. Both about the peace process and this notion of kind of wanting to kind of move forward and kind of make progress, but at the same time, in this work, every time that's kind of frustrated by the thing coming back to the start again and then repeating again, and so it forms a kind of a loop in a way, which is something that I've used in a number of other works also. Anyway, so these works were. I think that's a wrong date, actually. Yeah, it's 1995. So this is one of a group of works that I made in 1995 along the border, called At the Border, which again was kind of just after the IRA ceasefire and before that ceasefire broke down in 1996. Which kind of, in some ways, kind of imagine the border in different kind of ways, both in relation to the image and the past, the future, how the border kind of exists as a line or not as a line. So I want to run through these kind of reasonably kind of quickly, stay within my 20 minutes. This is a work made around the same time. And I suppose I'm kind of interested in that kind of ambiguity of this image of a fence, because it's unclear whether you're inside the fence or you're outside the fence. And so, I suppose a lot of the work that I was making around that time tried to kind of look at some of those kind of ambiguities around the border and what the border meant, how it was located, and how it exists within the imagination as much as it exists as a kind of physical entity. And I want to show you a little clip of a work called Ghost Story that I made in 2007, which is largely shot on the same place, the line, this former railway track that crosses the border. And as you can see, at this stage was becoming more of the kind of cycle track and the cycle path that it is today. And this, as I say, this work was made in 2007 for the Venice Biennale, and in some ways, there's a kind of I guess almost a 10-year gap, or more than a 10-year gap, between making this work and the earlier work that I'd made at the border. And in some ways, this work attempts to kind of explore some of what happened in that kind of 10 years. You know, the idea of dealing with the past, and how the landscape itself, which is, I think, what you'll hear in the clip that I'm going to play you, in some ways becomes a kind of repository for some of the experience or kind of trauma of the past. So I'm still interested in that kind of idea of how these fault lines or these kind of places along the border and places within Derry still have that potential, have that kind of possibility. So I'll play you a few minutes of this.
The scene reminded me of the faces in a running crowd that I had once seen on a bright but cold January afternoon. Men and women slipped on icy puddles as they ran for safety. A few, in their panic, ran towards a wire fence, further trapping themselves. As they scaled the fence, a military vehicle drove through it, tossing them into the frosty air. Troops spewed from the back of the vehicle as it screeched to a sudden halt. They raised their rifles and fired indiscriminately into the fleeing crowd. The next day I walked over the waste ground that was now marked by deep tire tracks and footprints, fixed in low relief and highlighted by a sharp hoarfrost. I could find no other traces of the crowd. I returned many times to the same site until another fence was erected and a new building was put in place of the empty, silent reminder. I wondered about what had happened to the pain and terror that had taken place there. Had it been absorbed or filtered into the ground, or was it possible for others to sense it as I did? The narrow streets and alleyways that I walked along became places where this invisible matter could no longer be contained. It seeped out through every crack and fissure in the worn pavements and crumbling walls. Its substance became visible to me in the mossy, damp corners that never seemed to dry out in winter or summer. A viscous secretion oozed from the hidden depths. The smell of ancient mold mingled with the creeping odor of dead flesh. The ground was often slippery underfoot, as if the surface of the road was no longer thick enough to conceal the contents of the tomb that lay beneath the whole city.
Okay, so I'm going to finish now with this work that I've just made this year, which is called Between, with the roads between Derry and Donegal across the border. I made this for an exhibition that opened a few weeks ago in Talbot Rice Gallery in Edinburgh. So I've been photographing the roads along the border over the last 3 or 4 months of last year. I kind of realised that there are 20 places where the border, as it kind of meanders along the kind of west bank here, crosses a road. So as you can see in some of them, you still see these kind of the lines where the Donegal County Council tore up the one end, and whoever it is responsible here in the north, the Roads Authority, tore up to their part of it. So it's quite a simple work. I mean, it's an image of each of these 20 places, and I included text with each panel. You know, the first one between the future and the past, and then between delusions and dreams. So I guess it's a work that's made within the context of looking at these borders again in the midst of the kind of Brexit shambles or debate, and also, I mean, I hadn't actually looked at the border in a number of years. I hadn't actually been making a lot of work around the border, so it was kind of interesting to go back and kind of look at this space again. And my inclusion of text in the work is in some ways a kind of an echo back to the work that I was making in the 80s, where I was kind of looking at the border and kind of working with image and text. So yeah, it's a particular kind of work. All right, I'm going to stop here and leave it there because I've got a few minutes over my 20 minutes, and thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone for coming and for Nathan and Mary for inviting me. My name's Darran Anderson. So I'm a writer primarily in the field of urbanism and architecture, so mainly write about cities. I'm originally from Derry, but I live in England. And I'd like to talk today about I grew up in Rosemount as a child, but when I was about 14, I moved out to the border. My grandmother died, and we moved out right next to the border to be next to my grandfather, who was ill at the time. So I had a strange experience of being in the inner city and then suddenly being shifted to this weird kind of liminal place. And I'd like to just talk about how the border has kind of had an indirect effect on my work in cities. This particular image, we're going to go quite far away to begin, is in the US-Mexico border. It was taken this year. On the left-hand side, you have a place called Friendship Park, south of San Diego. On the right-hand side, you have Tijuana, Mexico. The photograph is by Guillermo Arias. And the reason it kind of fascinates me is because it shows the various dimensions of borders. So you have the kind of desolation and the sort of the liminal side on the left-hand side. And then you have the kind of bustling conurbation that tends to grow up around borders where things like, gambling, and there's always a change in the laws, so you can always get away with stuff on the other side of the border. But it also shows, as Willie mentioned, the fictitious element to borders and how they kind of disrupt, but they're also essentially born in the ideas and decisions of individuals. This photo is so strange looking because the border, it kind of shows us what a border is. It's basically a political decision by an authority imposed upon a space where it doesn't necessarily belong. And you can see that the border just cuts right through the landscape, and the landscape kind of pays no attention to it. It just carries on. The waves just keep carrying on. This is an image that I took. So this is our own version of the border fiction, if you will. This is the Northern Irish Republic of Ireland border at the moment. It's invisible. It's just a few fields in that direction. And this is the walk that I would do from the city centre as a teenager, usually steaming, out that walk to get to home, which was further on towards the border, towards Mayville. At the moment, of course, the border is essentially invisible, but it may not remain that way for long. There's still some traces of fragments of the border. So this is one of the customs huts, just at Muff there, right on the border. And this is another one out the line that Willie was showing earlier, where the sort of railway track is already overgrown. This is the sort of phantom railway that used to go into Donegal. The important thing, I think, that these remind us is that history is contingent, that it's dependent upon decisions, political decisions. And we tend to forget that the border was there and it vanished, which itself was a political decision. But even the existence of the border itself, when it was first formed, nobody wanted the border. Edward Carson didn't even want the border. Unionists either wanted the entire of Ireland to stay within the United Kingdom, and Republicans wanted, a united Ireland. So it was a kind of botched compromise to begin with. It was always kind of doomed in a sense. And if you look at the Boundary Commission and the various government departments that formulated the border, they tended to, they were throwing in ideas. Should we include Donegal? Should we have Monaghan? Should we have Leitrim? Should we maybe have less? Should we make Northern Ireland essentially just around Belfast, or cut it off west of the Bann? And the one they decided, the form of this boundary, which also cuts Ulster, the ancient province of Ulster, it cuts a border through Ulster, is the country that we know now, or the sort of province that we know now, which itself, like Willie was saying, is a fiction. It's something that was invented, that nobody really wanted in its current form. Now, there's a personal dimension to the border for me, and basically for everybody who grew up in Derry or Donegal or anywhere in the north or along the northern boundary. But it's particularly apt when you have family, you have actual events that sort of occur around this area. One of the things I should say, actually, in the previous image, is that these traces that are left of the border, part of me really wishes that we had kept a few of the checkpoints as sort of memorials, because working in London for British publications, who are normally very lovely people, I get mansplained and womansplained on a regular basis that there was no border, despite the fact that it was at the end of my street growing up, and that we constantly got hassle going through it, and the IRA would occasionally fire rockets at it. So that didn't exist, apparently. But this is the boundary that we currently have. So just before Derry, if you head up towards Strabane, if you follow the foil up, the border actually goes along the middle of the river. And it stops just there at a very, very surreal point that you can see in Google Maps, which I love. It just makes no sense, and it was obviously just done with, a sort of set square. And then it bends around to encapsulate the west bank of Derry, which at that stage was gerrymandered as a unionist kind of stronghold. So they wanted to hang on to that. So they did a kind of pincer movement around and swallowed up Derry, which was possibly a mistake on all sides of the argument. But that's the way it looks. So you've got the Republic of Ireland there to the west, and Northern Ireland to the east, the United Kingdom. My next book is called Inventory, and it's a memoir of my family, mainly my grandparents and parents, and a wee bit about me growing up in the Troubles. That's the least interesting, but the main interesting bit is the grandparents. There's a river connection. There's a connection to this map, essentially, and throughout the book. So in my family, on one side, my maternal side, my grandfather was a fisherman on the River Foyle. He also swept for mines after the war. He pulled suicide victims out of the water. He used to search for them. And he was a smuggler during the war. So he essentially smuggled across this boundary, bringing things in from the south. The guards used to say, his name was Anthony McMonigal, and they used to call him a bastard. They say, Anthony, you bastard, we're going to find out where you've got your stash hid. And they never did. And just before he died a few years ago, he told me that he kept it in Maville Lighthouse. And the guards were searching up and down the coast for it. And all the while, it was in the lighthouse directly in front of them with a flashing light on top. And it always makes me think, everything I know about Donegal is like a Coen Brothers film. It's just like, it would make a great scene. Just to depress everybody, the river also has family connotations in the fact that the other side of culture in Derry and common experience in Derry is the amount of suicides in the river. And my paternal grandfather drowned in the river as a result of a drunken accident. And my paternal grandmother, a few years later, drowned as a consequence of suicide. So those topics are covered in the book Inventory, which is coming out in the autumn with Chado and Windows. And it's very much based around the borderlands where I grew up, where they interacted, and then the fact that, they lost their lives there while the other side of the family were earning a living off the same space. So when you put up a border, it has these massive repercussions that just reverberate for every level of society and people's everyday experiences. Fitting in with the, a lot of the talks I give elsewhere are about cities, and one of the things I like to emphasize that is history is contingent. So when you look at the skyline of a city, you're always looking at the dreams and decisions of individuals. So none of it's natural or inevitable. It's the result of people deliberately deciding to do certain things. And that gives us, once we realize that gives an incredible power, but there's also a horrendous amount of responsibility with that as well. Northern Ireland, I guess, fits into a sort of semi-colonial history. And what you tended to find was in places outside the empires or on the periphery, or places that the empires had their sights set on, this tended to happen, which is people in the colonial capitals would sit with rulers and just draw straight lines through, create countries essentially, and it had massive repercussions for the people living there. These lines would be drawn with rulers, but they were cut across, rivers, mountains, natural resources, languages, tribes, ancestral homelands. And the people in the colonial capitals would have very little idea of essentially what they were doing. They would box in groups of people who didn't want to be boxed in, and they would cut off access to certain places for others. And we're still living with the legacy of these decisions today. But again, these were fictions that were dreamt into being. They weren't what the people there wanted. An example, of course, being the Middle East. We're seeing yesterday, I think, the last ISIS stronghold fell in Syria. Now, one of the roots of the Syrian civil war and pretty much all the conflict in the Middle East, all the modern day conflict at least, was down to this decision, which is called the Sykes-Picot map, which basically it determined that everything in A went to France, France's sphere of influence, everything under B went to Britain, and they just cut a nice straight line going across all these different cultures, all these different homelands, all these different languages. And of course it had disastrous effects. There's a quote, Mark Sykes, one of the people who made this map, there's a quote from him in Downing Street at the time saying, "I would like to draw a line from the E in Accra to the last K in Kirkuk." So this is the kind of rationale that went on. And they're cutting it through people's lives, essentially, and through people's homes with disastrous repercussions. This is an example of what happens when there's a sudden border comes into play. Again, I like looking at the repercussions of these things because they always have a human side. So this is the airport at Nicosia in Cyprus when the Cypriot Civil War happened. This was abandoned, and there was a line essentially drawn across Cyprus, separating the Greeks from the Turks. This is still there, and you can still go see it. And that was much bigger when I when I saved it. You'll have to imagine it's an abandoned. It's a wonderful picture. It's an abandoned plane that never got a chance to take off. Another example of the repercussions, so you have borders just suddenly appearing, suddenly people deciding to put a border and it having these massive aftershocks and repercussions on normal people. This is an example of when a border is gotten rid of. So there was essentially everyone knows about the Berlin Wall, but there was a boundary right through the whole of Germany. And various places in the Eastern Bloc where the Soviet zone and the Allied zone, there would be checkpoints and a huge border that just cut its way through the country. So this is looking into the Russian zone, obviously. And since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, this death zone, which basically if you had went into this, your chances of being killed were almost certain. If you go to Berlin, you can see all the memorials to people who tried to get across and were shot. Men, women, and lots of young men, particularly. And this is what a great swathe of it looks like now. It's a green belt that goes through the entire of Germany from top to bottom. And it shows what happens whenever we get rid of these sort of man-made horror shows, that there's actually this place where humans weren't allowed to go. So just like in Chernobyl or somewhere, wildlife tends to flourish where, humans fear to tread. So that's the repercussions that can happen when we get rid of borders. And I mean, in Northern Ireland, getting rid of the border is seen as almost a universally positive thing. There's pretty much no voices demanding it back. Unless they're lunatics. And the seamless transition between, one of the reasons that the Good Friday Agreement has succeeded in a way, as flawed as the years since have been, is because it gives a kind of mutual illusion and a mutual fiction that satisfies both sides. So unionists can be safe in the knowledge that they're still part of the UK. And people from a Republican background like myself can fool ourselves into thinking that we have a united Ireland when we don't actually legally. But it's a fiction and it's a leap of faith that we like to make. And really all nations, unless you're, some nations, all nations are kind of fictional entities. And there's a multitude of nations and states that have died out in the past centuries. Some are easier fictions to believe than others. So Ireland is a kind of easy fiction to believe because it's surrounded by water and you have countries surrounded by desert or surrounded by mountains. Other ones are a hard sell. And I think Northern Ireland's always, even the advocates of Northern Ireland, it's always been a hard sell. Just returning to the image that we had at the beginning, which was the US-Mexico border. This is a section of it that's, I believe it's in California, in a place called the Imperial Sand Dunes. And it's called a floating fence, which means that it actually moves with the sand. So there's something kind of beautifully and terribly artful about it. It will move the way borders tend to shift through time. This one's actually sort of constantly moving, but it's constantly obstructive as well, and it's got a very dystopian look to it. And this is perhaps the kind of future of a boundary like that, where you have this sort of Ozymandias kind of idea that whatever boundaries we put up, they'll one day be ruins, you know, like the Great Wall of China, or there'll be tourist traps. And there's a kind of hubris to putting up these walls, and inevitably over time a nemesis to this process. They'll all end up as kind of ruins eventually, and even the nation states, the fictions that we've believed in so much and we tie our identities to, end up becoming abolished themselves. No one believes in the fiction anymore. There's no one, there are no patriots anymore for the Bavarian Soviet Republic, but at one stage people were dying for that nation, and it's the world over. You know, we forget the long view of history. This is the Moroccan Western Sahara Wall, so it's a very kind of desolate place, and it looks like a kind of failure, but it's actually, I believe it's the longest continuing minefield in the world. So although it looks easy to get past, it would be probably fatal to do so. One thing I'd like to touch on is why a border is needed to begin with. And there are obviously practical reasons, and countries have their sovereignty, whether a country is fictional or not. You know, there's a legal process to life, and there's citizenship and passports and all the rest. And these things are of practical importance. But there are other reasons, and you see this a lot in America with the US-Mexico border, where there are clearly ulterior motives at stake. Very often a nation or a people will define themselves by what they are not, or what they believe themselves to not be. And very often it comes down to we are the civilized because the other is the barbarian, the barbarian at the gates. And it's a very comforting illusion that we have, and that we try to convince ourselves that we are civilized because someone else isn't. And it's usually the people on the other side. And everyone does that. I believe that borders, there's such a focus in borders, partly because it's a way of distracting us from the other borders, and the main border being the haves and the have-nots, which exist within every society and which fuel so much conflict and division. This is from a series that Johnny Miller made called Unequal Scenes, where he used drones to show the essential haves and have-nots of society. I believe this was shot in South Africa, so you can see the clear demarcation lines within a society, within a nation, of who has and who hasn't, and the kind of boundaries that are put up. You can actually see it from the sky. There's a quote I'd like to just finish with, which is a kind of self-reflective one, and I believe it's where we're at the moment, and it's from Solzhenitsyn, the Russian writer. And he said, if only it were all so simple, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart? And yet, I feel with the concentration on borders all around the world, we're doing that every day. We're destroying a piece of ourselves. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to The Void, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about my work and the journey into a current show that I have in Limerick City Gallery. But to start with, I'm going to talk about some of the work that I have been doing in the last couple of years that's taken me to some very remote parts of the world. And what I like to do is to look at places where you can see the raw effects of climate change. So this is a photograph of the Arctic Circle a couple of years ago, and I was doing a project on glacial retreat. And I was recording the sounds of the glaciers dying for a sound piece that I was working on with a composer. So this piece has informed an entire exhibition called Crystalline. And the next piece I'm going to show you now is a follow-on from that. It's a collaboration I'm doing with the European Space Agency that's come from the idea of what we've done, the impact we've had on nature and what has happened to the glaciers as a result of refraction and the heat that's left in the atmosphere from the fact that the glaciers are affected by the heat of the carbon. So there's a solar orbiter is a spaceship that's going to be launched next year into space, and its mission is to go right to the very tip of the sun to investigate, at very small close-up level what we've done, what the hell is going on up there. And there's a very interesting material that's covering the front of the solar orbiter, and it's a combination of charred bone and carbon, which has been deemed as the most indestructible material in the world because of the way it's made. But I found the irony of that so brilliant, because carbon is the material that is stuck in the atmosphere, yet it is the one thing that's going right up close to the front of the sun. And charred bone is the earliest material we used in cave paintings, and so it was the earliest material that made the earliest marks, and it's going right into the future. So this beautiful synergy between these two things. So I was invited to work with this material, and I made this series of work. So it will exist in two places, on the front of Solar Orbiter and in this installation. And when they copped how actually dodgy it was that I had this material, because it needs to be patented, etc. NASA got in touch and tried to get it back, but I wouldn't give it back. So that's kind of a nice twist in the work. But so I made a long series of these works, one in fact for every year that's gone by since the Industrial Revolution, which is the time deemed to be when we change nature. So and then this is also a site of a lot of my work at the moment. It's a controlled environment for plants. I work a lot with plants and with the idea of air and the idea of our relationship as humans and our lungs to that of plants, because plants are like the lungs of the planet. They produce our air, and without them we wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have any food, and we wouldn't be able to breathe. So these set of plants are being foraged from all around the world, and they're the earliest forms of the ginkgos and the earliest ferns that we ever had. So by looking at the stomata on these plants, we can tell where we're going to be in 200 years' time. So, and this is a film that I've made. It's called In Search of a Remedy, and it's a 4-minute piece, and every few seconds a page goes by, and it's a very old book of remedies of Irish plants that informed the origins of medicine. And as the pages turn, the plants change, and I worked with a chemist in order to show the effects of climate change in each one of those plants. So that's just a few pieces. I just want to give you a lead into now this question of looking at the land and looking at what we've done. It brings me to Ireland in this last show, and it's called Hidden Monuments. I was invited to respond and address a series of linear earthworks called the Black Pig's Dyke that run along the Irish border, close to, adjacent to, and there's 9 in total in this particular alignment, and they are hugely interesting to me because for many, many reasons. But firstly, when I was invited to address them, I had the really lucky position of being able to take a couple of years to embed myself in the research, because I just looked at it and thought, I actually can't respond to this because I don't know enough about it. There wasn't enough information. There's a lot of stuff written about it, but nobody seemed to have a real handle on it, because the radiocarbon dating information that came out of 20, 30, 40 years ago had become obsolete. So I was very lucky to get to work with a current radiocarbon dating program that was going on, and I ran my project alongside it. So a lot of the work I'm going to talk about now is actually the research, because the research became the work. I turned into a bit of an investigator for 2 years, and found myself, as I was finding bits of truth that were proven by the archaeologists, the artwork was made alongside of that. So you see them, the little squiggles in red, and they're an east-west trajectory. They don't work in a line, not that we can see visually here, but people think of them as an alignment. Monuments that go from east to west relate to, occupations such as food, fertility, alignments with the sun, summer and winter solstice. Monuments that go north and south relate to death and spirituality. So this alignment, I'm working as a solar scientist and looking at them in terms of, how they are placed in the landscape. And it became hugely interesting to me was the actual precise locations, because when you stand on them, there's one in Monaghan, which is where I'm from, and it's 15 miles long, and I've walked most of them on performed walks, but the one in Monaghan is spectacular. You wouldn't know from the road what it is until you go onto it, and then you realise you're standing on this ancient monument that is so eroded and so sort of obscure that it was left in the landscape, and it's not been touched in all this time. Some of them actually don't. You can't see them anymore because of tilling and farming and removal of sections of land. But this one in Monaghan is perfectly intact, and it's like there's a willow forest over it, and it's got the most beautiful birds and flora and fauna. It's like as if the animals were attracted to the ancientness of it, because there's a certain particular set of birds that hang out on the site, and then they don't hang out anywhere else. It's like as if they're attracted to the energy of it. But this is what it looks like in plan. So it's a bank and a ditch, and they're all the same all over Europe. It's kind of, the north is, I think, higher than the south, and they've scraped the land back. There's an artist's impression here which gives a better idea. It's a drawing that was made. So if you can imagine, it took enormous effort 2,000 years ago. They're Bronze Age. They were dug out in Bronze Age. And the earth was scraped back and shoved up to the left and shoved up to the right. And actually it's quite several meters in width when you're standing on it. And then, really interesting, the Irish oak trees were cut down and lined the entire sides. So there's been so many different interpretations of what they were. Were they military? Were they religious? Were they, there's countless efforts made to understand them. But actually, because they were made before written record, nobody has a clue. And a lot of people, because of Brexit, have become very interested in them because of their relationship to the length of the border. So parts of them, anyway, when I did my walks, so John Leslie, part of Leslie's Castle, a wonderful guy from the 70s, very notably, I don't know if anybody remembers him, but he was always making sightings of UFOs, and he was a very popular writer at the time, and he walked the entire length of Ireland to see them, and he wrote a wonderful text. And I tried to follow partly in his footsteps. I haven't done the entire length, but I'm working with a composer at the moment, and every now and again we walk some of it. One of the wonderful things is that there's parts that you see and there's parts that you don't see, and the parts you don't see became more important to me, because in a way they represented the gaps in knowledge and the gaps in kind of our psyche, where we know something's there but we're not sure of it or not. So I started to see it, the whole line, as a sort of theme or a sound score across the country, because when you look in LiDAR or you look from space, we photographed it from space, you see the seam underground, but you can't see it on the land in some of the cases. And it was like this theme of, because I work a lot with sound waves and seismologists, so I see the earth, and underneath I'm very interested in the vibrations beneath our feet and how much they inform kind of what the Earth is trying to tell us. So my interest became so great in the idea of the precise locations of 2,000 years ago. We don't know why they did it, but why did they do it exactly there? Why did, in Monaghan, for instance, when I walk it, why was it here and not there? Like, what attracted to them? So I started to think about the rock and the line of geology that crosses Ireland and what was in the rock. What were they tuning into? So it turns out there's a mine in Monaghan called Conway Gold, and they found gold. And this is a core that I've been working with. It's 400 million years old. And they have found, funnily enough, across the border that there's gold. Because when you go into the National Museum, which I spend a lot of time in there, looking at the artifacts that came out of the bogs near the border and looking for clues to understand what was this whole thing about. And of course, there's room after room of these most magnificent torques and objects from 2,000 years. I mean, you look at the labels, they come from Monaghan, Cavan, Donegal, and we're still finding more of them. So it's sort of a clue as to, like, what were Irish men doing? So when I identified this line of gold, the Geological Survey of Ireland taught me a lot about it, because in the rivers near the borders is where they found the gold, because as we all know, gold ends up in the water and they shake it, and then you end up, they made these incredible torques, which up until recently people have thought is jewellery, but actually it's not. They are calendars to the sun. So in one of the pieces that I've made is this very long drawing that's been informed by the geology that I was investigating across Ireland, and the line of gold, and then the precise locations of the dike. And the sound piece hasn't been finished. It's going to be launched at the next iteration of Hidden Monuments. And the composer is David Stalling. So we've been working on it for quite some time. So he's making sound recordings on each of the sites. And the idea that we're trying to work on is this idea of signalling, which I'll get into in a minute. But these are some of the torques that have come out of near Cavan and Monaghan at the time of the dike being built. But one of the most interesting points and that raised questions in my project was, the dike was cut out, it was dug out in Bronze Age, but they were left in the landscape for 1,000 years. And then an entirely new set of people in 100 BC took them over. So you can imagine that's like 1,000 years of people and belief systems and everything in Ireland. So 1,000 years later, and this is where the radiocarbon dating program came in. The palisade fence, which is the wooden fence I was talking about, the oak trees, they were systematically burnt right across Ireland. It took 5 years for the burning to happen, and the massive amount of effort it took in order to make that burning, because burning oak is not easy. And if you don't have mechanism to make a fire, it's really not easy. So it was a concerted effort, and all the different dikes were burnt at the same time. And we know that from what we found in the ground during the archaeological dig. And but this is where it gets really interesting, because I was scratching away trying to piece this stuff together. And when I looked at the timeline, Ireland, because a lot of my work is in Iceland, and I look at the effects of glaciers and volcanology on ancient Irish weather patterns, because a lot of our blights, etc., were caused by the fact that volcanoes went off, ash ended up in Ireland, and our crops failed. And that was like further in time. But going back to this time, Ireland was on its knees in 100 AD, which is 1,000 years later. There was a 20-year period where there was mayhem going on. And we know that because the hill of Tara was burnt. There's a lot of burnings up in Donegal and over in Armagh, and these round structures. And in that 20-year period, there was mass food shortages, there was depopulation, there was sacrificial murders, This is one of the pieces that I have in the exhibition. It's part of the actual trees that were burnt, and some of them have been carved into beads and a sort of a necklace relating to the burnings that happened. But I was allowed to work with this material from the National Museum, bloody hell. So this, along some of the border sites, you know this guy from the National Museum, he's the guy with the Brill cream, he's very famous. He was one of the guys that was sacrificed, and his body was placed on the borderlines of where they cross for the Black Pigs Dyke during that 20-year period. So it seems like, and this is one of the Tara burnings, they would basically put loads of rocks in, sometimes a person or a baby in the centre, burn the hell out of it, and it was a ritual, it was an actual ritual. So I started looking at these rituals, and during the summer, while all this was happening, we all know about the heat, what was going on in Ireland. This started happening, and I got in touch with these guys. This is in Newgrange. The heat caused these henges to come to the surface because of the scorched marks in the earth were caused by the fact that there was drought in the land. Up came these incredible henges that we never knew about that were signalling into our present time. So I began to link these projects, even though there was a couple of thousand years between them, that asking questions about like, what are these things coming into our present time to tell us? What have we done to nature? And we had a conversation with the guys who built these 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. What would they think of what we've done to nature, and what would they be telling us now? Because in a way, it feels like the earth is bringing these things to the surface for some sort of mythical message. And so they began to inform a lot of the shapes that I was working with. And that's me in the middle. I started doing a lot of performed walks in the middle of the henge, and I didn't really think they were going to become part of a work, but they did. I made a film. I just wanted to, because I knew they'd reveal themselves for a 20-day period, and then they would disappear back down again. Just like the dike, this part of the dike is available to us and part of it isn't. And when it rains, sometimes you can see it, and sometimes it really comes to the fore. This is part of a series of works that I've been doing on the dike, on the different dikes called signalling, and it's where I'm using copper and bronze and gold, which are part of my paintings. I'm placing them at different sites, and playing with the alignment of the sun when it comes out. And on winter solstice this year, at 12 o'clock, the sun beamed, and they all started to signal backwards and forwards to each other. So it became a piece of work. And this is a painting, part of a series of paintings that I've done called Compressed Time, about the idea of, these layers of compression in the land that have kept these secrets, away for so long, that have come up into our present time. This is also as part of the rituals that I was researching. I started to make similar fires on the dike and work with the sun. So this is a series of photographs. It all went very well until the fire brigade was called one of the days. Postman blew the whistle. This is the show in Limerick, and sorry, I skipped over that. This is just a photographic grid showing some of the work that I've done on the dike. It went on for quite some time, and I think I've only scratched the surface. I'll be doing more. As the sound piece progresses, we'll be making more of these interactions on the landscape. So this is what the work looks like in the main room in Limerick City Gallery. I've made an enormous circle. I've used the direct geometry of the henge in Newgrange to inform the scale of the circle. The circle is made from charcoal that's parabolically treated. It's from the current trees in Ireland. It's oak and willow and birch. And so again, this idea of the past, portals of time coming into our present time. And over in the glass box is the ancient circle, the sort of the necklace torque. On the right, there's a series of charcoal sticks that relate to the palisade fence that was burnt, and it also has a sense of notation or musical context to it. To the right is the sound score, and to the back is a large calfskin with 24-karat gold relating to the Lunyala I know I'm nearly out of time, so are we out of time? This is the film that I've made. It's a 5-minute film about, about the notion of fire and forestry in the world at the moment and what we've done to nature, but it also shows imagery going backwards and forwards into present and back to Bronze Age. And these are some of the paintings that are made on gold leaf and on copper in some cases, and they act like mirrors in the gallery. They reflect the works backwards and forwards to each other. And this last image shows a very small piece that's made from bone, and I wanted to bring up the question of like, what are we leaving in our landscape for future generations with what we've done? Because that's, when you walk around and you find monuments such as the henges from Neolithic or Bronze Age, and we trip across them, and you really contemplate them, and you bring them into our present time, and you think about what is the meaning of this, particularly along the border, and then you think about what we're leaving for future generations. So these bones, to me, represent, when we die, that we leave our own bones in the landscape, and or the bones of, and that evidence of the marks that we've left behind. So thank you very much.
First of all, I want to thank all the speakers. It was really interesting, and everyone's coming from very diverse backgrounds, but the one thing that I thought resonated with all of your work, obviously it's talking about landscape, but each of you are kind of looking at ways of mapping the landscape. And I think the idea of fiction as well came up a lot. So I don't know, Willie, if you want to talk a little bit about, I know W.G. Sebald was one of the writers that influenced you about your work around fiction. So do you want to talk about the influence of fiction and the idea of imagining borders or imagined landscapes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in, as I said earlier, in relation to photography, that this notion that somehow photography is connected with the truth. I mean, there's I suppose a kind of cultural understanding almost of that is one of the roles of photography. And obviously that is something that is kind of seriously undermined in the contemporary world, Not that it was ever on very sound ground anyway. But I mean, I think I'm interested in the possibilities of fiction within that context, and also in the context of when we're talking about landscape or kind of borders, the notion that about the border being fixed in some way. But I'm kind of more interested in the idea of how they're more pliable in that, or they become unfixed. And the idea of kind of imagined spaces rather than spaces that are in some ways kind of closed down, I mean, another way that I've been kind of thinking about that recently is in the context of fake news, this idea of the unreliability of what we're told and the kind of stories we're told and what is authoritative, and that there perhaps isn't anything anymore, or there's a determination or an effort to kind of undermine notions of truth, and what is kind of newsworthy, and and how we might use that. And I think for me as an artist, I mean, one of the concerns I have with fiction is that it's in some ways you could say it is connected to the idea of a lie, in the sense that it's something that is made up. But I think the difference is that a lie attempts to take us away from the truth, whereas I think fiction can often take us closer to the truth, So for me, that is the kind of the value in working with language in my work, and alongside photography, how these things, and with video, how these two things might kind of play off each other. In a situation, particularly in relation to the border or to political or other kinds of entities that we sometimes think of as being fixed, is that we don't have a choice, that they are things that we're given, But I think, as you pointed out earlier, this kind of sense that these spaces are constructed, that human beings have made decisions, and those can be kind of traced, I think that's a kind of valuable way of kind of looking at it. And I think, the efforts of kind of artists, of writers, of landscape designers, kind of all filter into that kind of experience of how we understand landscape and how we kind of use it, and how it's kind of shaped by the actions of these individuals and these bodies, but also how it kind of exists in our imagination, how we can make and unmake it, So I think for me that's a kind of powerful sort of dynamic that we're probably kind of in the middle of a kind of a moment where that's feels much more critical now, because of the kind of political turmoil that we're living through, not just in relation to Brexit, but certainly in the States along the kind of US-Mexico border as well. That kind of sense of it being something that's been kind of made and remade before our eyes almost sometimes, So for me, it's all of that is a really kind of fertile and kind of quite dynamic kind of set of possibilities. And I suppose in the context of my own work, I've always kind of felt I don't know if obligation is the right word, but I've always been kind of attracted to try and make sense of the place that I find myself living in, and I suppose I started doing that when I was an art student. I suppose really as a kind of in Belfast in the late 70s, where no offence to Jackson Pollock in this, to think about abstract expressionism seemed, less pressing than trying to kind of figure out what was happening on the streets outside in Belfast, But I guess there's always that kind of push and pull between how artists kind of deal with the world, that kind of sense of the work having its own kind of integrity and existing on its own kind of merits and on its own behalf, but also wanting to engage with this kind of bigger social, political and economic context that we all live within, So I think that in that sense it's kind of useful to think of the potential of fiction or storytelling and the imagination in trying to kind of make sense of it,
Yeah, because I think what's emerged since talking about Brexit over the last while is this idea of, as Darran was talking about, this idea of the border being fictional for certain people. So I've definitely had conversations with people that they don't believe that the Irish border existed, and Darran, you were kind of talking about that's been your experience as well, where it's...
But even in politics, the UP have recently been, I think Arlene Foster claimed that the border never existed,
But it seems quite incredible that people can make those type of claims.
Well, for me that is kind of connected to this notion of kind of fake news, if you keep saying that that didn't happen, like it wasn't there, the two things are not unrelated, I don't think,
Yeah. Darran, can you talk about it, because your work is quite biographical, I guess, in terms of the book that you've currently got coming out that really addresses your...
Well, I'd agree with what Willie was saying about, I find that in England, some of it's innocent, sort of naivety or ignorance, but you definitely get people like the DUP where it's, when they talk about the border, it's sort of like, right, are you going to believe us or your own lying eyes? Like your own experience. And I see it as a way of kind of almost political gaslighting, to be honest. I think it's removing the very concept that there was a truth, and you know, they sort of engaged in a very disingenuous form of relativism that has innate bad faith at its heart. You know, not to single them out particularly, because a lot of people do it across the board, but they're the current purveyors of it. I remember, I mean, my generation is an interesting one because we are kind of forgotten generation, Generation X, and rightly forgotten in a lot of ways, but what you would call the baby boomers, I guess, were immersed in the Troubles, and the millennials have sort of no direct or very indirect connections to the Troubles and the conflict. And my generation were close enough to see it and be affected by it, especially through our parents' experiences and trauma that was sort of passed on. Close enough to be witnesses, but far enough away to be, you know, to have a certain distance. We were the kind of bystander generation. We were the generation of the beginnings of the peace process, really, the kind of like the dairy girls and boys. And Lisa, who writes that show, was she was in Thornhill and we were in the other school. So, so in a way, as authors and artists and journalists, we were in a perfect position to witness things, to kind of understand what was going on, see a lot of stuff. But, I mean, even with our generation, there's a conspiracy of silence. There's a real omerta still about talking about things. And I found, I spent 4 years researching and writing this book, which involved researching every death in the Troubles, every major event, plus my own family history, a lot of which was extremely dark, involving the death of loved ones and attacks. You know, my father was a Bloody Sunday. He ended up in H-blocks. His brothers were in the H-blocks, Longkesh, blah, blah, blah. And that having this knock-on effect with us, you know, because then as a consequence of that, and bearing in mind my grandfather had fought in the British Army, so this weird knock-on effect where it affected my father's employment status. So we grew up very poor and we had to live in a certain place, and there's all this kind of repercussions. But even talking about those years and years later, it used to be that in Seamus Heaney's day, Heaney talks about whatever you say nothing, where there was this, it was dangerous to say stuff, it might get you killed. And in the last 20 years, it's been a similar silencing, but for different excuses. So now it's don't rock the boat. Tourism, investment, Game of Thrones, everything's fine. Belfast is booming. Shut your mouths, don't mention it. And I'm at the stage now where I've definitely got old enough to say, no, actually, these insane things happened, and I witnessed insane things happen, and I didn't even see a fraction of what my parents experienced. So now I would like to talk about that stuff, and hopefully people like me are increasingly doing that. But breaking through the conspiracy of silence is still exceptionally difficult. It's very uncomfortable dealing with, I mean, family members don't want you to talk. I talked to people in Belfast where I couldn't write down what they were telling me, let alone put it in the book. Because of the Boston tapes, there's a chance, you know, my house could get raided, hard drives be taken, all my research, I would be called up, you know, potentially to testify against people. So you can't even write these things down. Now, what kind of society do we want? We talk about all these platitudes about peace and reconciliation, but we're living in a society where journalists can't write down information of things that happened for fear of the repercussions. And again, cutting through this omerta where, you know, whatever you say nothing. But my patience has run out with that, and I hope other people's have as well.
And I guess you're looking at more kind of historical fictions in terms of the Black Pig Dyke, and a lot of these kind of claims are made for archaeology, where they keep on getting things, you know, they're kind of projecting of ideas of I know for a long time there's people trying to look for the Paleolithic or the existence of certain communities here. But the Black Pig Dyke is quite interesting anomaly in terms of it was an older border of Ulster as well, which I guess landscapes and borders are always constantly shifting as well. But can you talk about your like interest in kind of what brought you to becoming so interested in that type of history or archaeological history?
I was born with an innate interest in digging around looking for evidence, and as a painter I think the way I treat I've always been trying to scrape things back to look for the truth no matter what I'm looking at. But I have a relationship with landscape that has brought me to kind of trying to go down into it, and as a result of that, histories and what makes a particular territory, those stories have informed so many of my projects. I look for kind of gaps in history and places where, you know, things don't necessarily make sense, and I'm in this position in the School of Natural Sciences where I can work with lots of different, you know, geologists, seismologists and scientists, and it's wonderful. But one of the things that you know, that alarms me so much all the time about my discipline as an artist and theirs as, you know, a scientist, is that they can get to a certain point in a narrative or in a research project, and it's an hypothesis, and you know fine rightly in about 5 years' time that's going to be blown out of the water. But while they're there, they're holding strong to it, you know. But as an artist, you can go in, you know, with, you know, poetry, you can go in with archaeology, and you can create new meaning or open up projects in ways that people might not necessarily have thought of them, you know. So I like to bring all those disciplines together. Archaeology is really interesting, and we really need it. It's so important. It's about putting together data and building information on aspects of the earth, but it's not always, it looks through a particular lens and it builds information in a particular way. But then when you mix that with solar geography or any of the other disciplines, they all challenge each other. So it's important to look at the whole lot.
I guess memory is quite a key thing for you, and how that marks the landscape as well. So like a lot of your works, the photographs, it could be of a landscape, but it's of something that's happened there or a possible occurrence. Can you talk a bit about memory? I mean, I guess that, again, that goes back to truth and things like that. That's important in your work. But
yeah, to some extent. I mean, just to go back to Darran's point, I mean, about the kind of post-conflict context here. I mean, I think, you know, one of the ways in which the piece was cemented in a way was we were asked collectively to forget about the past somehow, you know, like, let's not deal with that, you know. And I think it's one of the kind of biggest failures of the whole project was that there was no agreed method for dealing with the legacy of the conflict, and that's still something that can't be agreed. And yeah, so in order to, you know, allow the kind of illusion of prosperity and things getting better to kind of happen, I mean, part of that was that we were kind of collectively told, and we kind of quite willingly kind of signed up to the idea that, yeah, Northern Ireland is booming, and, you know, the peace is great, and everybody's getting on brilliantly, you know. Yeah. You know, which is a complete illusion, you know. So I guess the work that I've been making in the last decade, in some ways, attempts to kind of deal with that, you know, to try and find a voice for how you might articulate that in some way, you know, which both kind of deals with memory, you know. And the clip that I played from Ghost Story, you know, that extract at the start of it deals with a memory of Bloody Sunday, but then tries to, in some ways, suggested the notion that those traumas are somehow embedded within the landscape itself. I mean, I think it was Susan McKay, the journalist and writer, who talked about that in her book about the experience of driving through the landscape in the north of Ireland, and you see, road signs for particular places, and you don't. It's not you just don't read this information as a pointer to a certain town, which is 20 kilometres away or 20 miles away, whatever. But the name itself brings back a memory of an event or of a trauma associated with those places. So, I mean, I think that experience of the landscape as something that's kind of marked with memory and with trauma is something that's very real and very present. And, perhaps that to some extent may account for your students' experience and the fact that people are willing and want to kind of talk to them about their experience of the troubles or the conflict or whatever. So on one hand, where people here are quite guarded, in the sense that people very quickly work out who you feel you can and you can't talk to, and the kind of stories you can tell. But also we, as I said, we collectively have indulged in a kind of amnesia, and certainly in terms of kind of mainstream dialogue, if you want, whether it's in the media, and largely in journalism as well. There hasn't been kind of much analysis of the kind of cost of that, in terms of how we haven't actually been able to, process it, deal with sectarianism, deal with kind of rebuilding of communities, dealing with what the border means. And Brexit is just really, in a particularly unhelpful way, just kind of made that experience worse because, in some ways people, the border within the Brexit context is understood as a kind of an economic kind of issue as much as anything else, but not in terms of the issue around kind of identity or how those kind of spaces are imagined, as I was saying earlier. So, a lot of this stuff is very kind of interconnected, but I think that omerta that Gareth mentioned there is like very, very present and very real. And and perhaps it is in the kind of realm of what artists do, what writers do, that there might be a context for beginning to, as I say, articulate some of that concern, because you kind of despair of the kind of politics as being an effective means of putting something in place that actually effectively does deal with this and does record the kind of stories, that journalists, and we've seen with the Loughlin Island film, are unable to speak about, and so a lot of that knowledge and that information and those stories will eventually become lost, So the collective experience of the conflict will eventually become lost as well, and it'll be told in some rather kind of sanitized ways, depending on which version of it you want to see, So yeah, as I say, as an artist, those are some of the things that I've been kind of thinking about as someone who kind of lives here and continues to try and kind of make work about this place, and yeah. So you kind of do your best, I guess.
Yeah, because I guess obviously Brexit reignited a lot of things that seem to were kind of under the surface, but probably always there. So maybe it's.
Yeah, we're very good at putting things just below the surface here.
Yeah. But I think it's kind of with this, people are talking about it more. I don't know if that's been your experience, Darran, or.
I think there's definitely a disconnect, like Willie says, between the way it's seen that I've experienced from London, looking back. My colleagues would have seen it as an economic, the Brexit as an economic thing or a political thing. And I'm constantly trying to emphasize that it's, as Willie said, it's a psychological thing for people in the north. And it's opening up a lot of wounds that we're never allowed to fully heal. And I know for a fact, I'm no psychologist, but if you bury a lot of trauma, then it doesn't lead to anything good. You know, decades later, this stuff comes up. And I've talked to people on both sides of the divide who were involved, you know, people who were interned and people who were put through what would be deemed as sort of torture while they were teenagers, you know. And also these men weren't saints by any stretch of the imagination, but put through very traumatic experiences. And talking to them now, where they're men in their 50s and 60s, as I said, I'm no psychologist, but I could read post-traumatic stress disorder in these guys' faces. Part of that, I think, is because, like Willie says, there hasn't been a reconciliation with the truth in any kind of way of talking it out. It's been all about burying. And I mean, I found myself actually doing it because it's an easier thing to do. So originally, when I came up with an idea about writing about the Troubles, all my work has been writing about cities and space all around the world. And then someone said, could you write about where you came from? And initially, so I came up with this book called Tide Rack that was going to be about the river, specifically about the river. And it was going to be, you mentioned Sebald, so it was going to be a Sebaldian book where everything is subtext and everything is about silences and about kind of insinuations and you know, this is where someone was killed, but you only get hints at it. There's all the subtext, all the stuff bubbling underneath. So I wrote that book, and when I handed it to the publisher, an English publisher who are great people, they're actually Sebald's publisher as well. They were just like, what is this? Is this a nature book? Is it a... And I had to explain, no, you know, you got to read between the lines. It's all about how people in Northern Ireland can't talk about stuff. And they were, but the thing is, it was so subtle that totally understandably, they were just like, this isn't about anything. And I was like, no, you don't get it. I'm writing the way that Northern Ireland exists. This is the problem. So the book is the problem. And eventually, we actually had to shelve it, so it was stuck in development hell for like 3 years. And eventually, I just said, right, forget about it, and spent 6 weeks and typed up the book called Inventory, which is a totally different book covering the same span. That's told, each chapter is an object, and each object is related to a memory of something that's happened. So they're kind of like icons or symbols, and the real objects. So my father's a gardener, groundsman for the council, and he would dig up stuff. You know, he'd come back from work, and me and my sister would be like, "What have you got for us today?" And he'd hand us like a gas mask that he'd buried, that he'd unearthed from the cemetery, and we'd play with it, put it on, or rubber bullets, or you know, all this stuff, and. So the Inventory book is a book of objects. I kind of nicked the idea from George Perec, but it's all toll-free objects. So telling the story through landscape, and like you said about Willie's work, you know, the memory being saturated in the landscape, didn't make the translation in the literature the way it does with art. It's extremely powerful and effective in Willie's work, but I just failed at translating it into words in a way that someone outside of Northern Ireland could understand. But the objects, the minute I handed it to their publishers, they were like, "Oh, thank Christ!"
They kind of had some
we were wondering what we'd bought, you know, and we were like, "This is the mad person in the attic that we're going to have to like." But it gave them something tangible that they could relate to, you know. So it starts off, the first chapter is a radio. And it's a real radio that we had in our house, and you used to be able to listen to the army on longwave, and you could hear the army going past. And my father actually found out that his mother had thrown herself into the river through listening into the radio. do the army receptions. So I've spoiled the opening phrase. You have to buy the book to find out what happens next.
But then it's really interesting, I mean, that sense of the people in Northern Ireland having a way of relating to the landscape, talking about it or not talking about it, or that kind of oblique way that people
There's
refer
a
to
code
things,
that
it's very,
that we understand
very
that maybe
codified,
doesn't go outside. And I found definitely, I mean, even with Sabol's publishers, I was trying to say to them, it's all between the lines, it's all hints, and like it can reveal so much. So my father's name's Seamus, and every time we went through the border, the checkpoint, and the same thing happened. Seamus Heaney, he wrote a poem about it. You'd wind down the window and they would say, "Where are you going?" And my dad would say, "Derry." So instantly they know what side of the divide you're on. And then he would say, the British soldier would say, "What's your name?" "Seamus." "Right, out." And search us and search the car. And it was so, things were pinpointed in language. And so therefore Northern Irish people had to develop a sort of code of the unspoken. And I think it's one of the reasons why Northern Irish people are good storytellers and good joke tellers, is because it's about not telling the story. It's about evasion and subterfuge and performance, so that we don't actually have to talk about the stuff that matters.
Yeah, the milkman was very good on that. And that she didn't give anybody a name, so it was really cleverly done to be able to maintain that through a whole book. So it is, again, going back to that language where you're not naming things, you're not naming names.
My book, I'm struggling with the publishers, because they're like, you have to put in everyone's names. And that's the point I'm at right at this moment, is can I get away with saying "da" all through the text, or "ma", because I don't live here, there might be repercussions, and I'm fully prepared to take flack myself, but you don't want anyone else having to have their life disrupted, So you have to be careful on orphan traumas as well. You have to be very delicate, because, especially if they're not your traumas.
Yeah. And you're from Monaghan as well, so you had a different border experience than...
Yeah, I kind of, I have certain memories myself, of going. I had a lot of friends in Armagh and Dundalk, and went to the Irish Gael, talked and headed up north and whatever. But we stayed more south than north. So I don't have very many personal experiences or family things that happened. But I know lots of people who do, so I'm very aware of it,
Did you feel it was a different place?
Not really, no, not at the time, no. But now that I go back, I do. I do. Yeah.
So maybe at this point, do you want to? I'll open it up, because we've been going for a couple of hours. Has anyone got any questions that they want to ask?
One thing that you said when you were looking at the Black Pig itself and asking what it was, and the two things you mentioned were, was it military or was it religious? For some reason that it's just struck me as something. I guess even all the work we've been doing on borders for the issue of people, I've really been thinking about military and political borders and this particular history of the border, but I maybe hadn't been thinking about this sacred idea that we attach to borders as well. And I think it kind of resonates with some of what Darran, you were talking about, how these are things that we just collectively agree to believe in, and there's a degree of belief and fiction and faith and these sort of these aspects of the border that are I guess mythic, or that we sort of mythicize them, or we make them symbolic in some way. That there's something important, and I don't know that I want to say positive, but that there's some way of looking at the border that isn't necessarily wholly negative. But anyway, it's just what I've been thinking about. I don't know whether...
Well, there's a huge array of folklore in UCD and in Trinity, where the stories are encased of the last couple of 100 years of people trying to apply meaning to what the Black Pig Strike was. And it's actually a contemporary term of maybe 200 years ago, where kids in schools that lived near the borders and near where the Black Pig's Dyke, where they knew these things were in the landscape, were trying to figure out what they were. And somebody came up with an idea that a schoolmaster, I'm trying to remember the story to give it justice, but a schoolmaster was telling the students that the dyke was created because a pig or a boar had put his nozzle into the land, and it was a mythical pig or a boar that drove itself through the landscape, and as it did, it separated, the soil, and that's what created the borders, and that spell would be cast on anybody who kind of didn't do their homework or whatever. And that became, and then there's necklaces of stories that came from that. And so the pig, while you think, oh, what's a pig, but like, where did that arrive in the Irish consciousness that a pig, because we allocate various animals to lots of different mythical stories, and they're not just randomly thrown out. They're related to a lot of the old stories about how our land evolved, and how Ireland ended up being in Ireland, because of course 350 million years ago we were north of the equator, We've just arrived down here just by proxy, So there's tons of stories that exist, very interesting stories, and they all relate to very logical aspects of how the border was deemed to have been formed. I looked at some of them. I'd love to introduce you to them. I'll show you in UCD where they are. Yeah. Amazing stuff and great poetry. I didn't get into too much of that for this part of the project because I wanted to place my attention on, when did this happen and all that kind of stuff. I didn't get time to get into it, but there's a load of very interesting information to do with rituals that happened as well. Well, of course, the thing I didn't mention earlier was in terms of the ritual aspect of the Black Pig's Dyke. Why were they doing these burnings? Why did they burn it, systematically across the country and go to all that effort to do that at a time when people were on their knees, they were starving? Where did the people come from to do that? And those questions have been answered in the last while. But because Ireland was so on its knees, there was a collective kind of consciousness of people getting together, probably driven by the kings at the time, to go to these sacred places, these portals. They felt that they were energetic systems that had some power, like we would maybe think of a church now, or a ley line or whatever. And they went there and they burnt the shit out of them, because myself and a couple of other archaeologists have read enough to come up with this idea, and I'm just putting it out there because God knows, but that they were invoking the power of the sun, because Irish people at that time thought the sun was God, and because they were looking for help, they were, reenacting these rituals to ask for help, because you can see it in the torques, in all the when you study the torques in the museums, which is what they were, the calendars to the sun. Every single permutation of the sun, be it looking through water, looking at it through a tree, at every single aspect around the year is incised in the motifs. So when you look at the calendar, you realize that these people knew how to read the sun, and the gold, and the way they embellished them was a sense of God. So it was an offering to the gods, perhaps, and it's written in some of the stories I was telling you about. And so I was thinking, what the hell are we doing now? I mean, they were asking for help. We're just screwing things up, and messing things up. They were so sophisticated. When you think about it, they didn't have anything. They just had the sun, and the winter and solstice, the alignments, and they knew how to put their crops in the ground. They knew when to harvest, and they didn't have that. They had nothing. They starved. So it was, this idea of ritual was very important.
There's a really interesting thing. I think it unites everyone that's been talking. I was thinking of iconography. So thinking about the mythological aspect, you've got somewhere like the North or Ulster or Northern Ireland, and you have these mythic stories that are tied to the land and are tied to tradition and passed down. So one of them, for example, is Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, fighting the rest of Ireland. And in recent years, there was an attempt to sort of rebrand him as a loyalist hero. So he was being painted on gable walls in Belfast and places. Cuchulainn was this Irish Celtic, tended to be nationalists or Republicans, used him as a figurehead. And then the loyalists said, no, well, actually, he was fighting the rest of Ireland, and he's part of our heritage. And so they were paintings of Cuchulainn. And then you have the Red Hand of Ulster, you know, which I've always thought is this amazing symbol of. I grew up as a very fearful symbol. It was like, don't go into the areas that have the red hand, you know, or you'll get killed. They'll ask you where you're from. And it's actually an ancient Celtic story of there was these kings, or the king sent these princes to discover the north from the sea. And it was the first to touch the land can own the land. So they were racing one another in ships. And one of the sons was ahead of the other son. And the son that was losing realised, so he cut off his hand and he threw it. And it landed on the shore first. So he got the claim, Ulster, Northern Ireland. And I've always thought it's amazing that not only do we live in a society where the flag is a severed hand, covered in blood, but that iconography has gone from being an ancient Celtic symbol to being the absolute embodiment of loyalism. It's on all the flags, it's on all the murals. So again, this thing, the borders shift, but the beliefs shift and the stories shift, and one side owns it and then the other side owns it. And really it's part of a collective conscious that we all share. We've infinitely more in common than we do different.
Just, I think, trying to bring that conversation together, I think it's really interesting the fact that the big fault line within the conversation that we sort of tend to sort of ignore, and it was really when you started talking about the Black Pig's Dyke and what it brought to my psychic memory. I remember when I went to Dublin first year course in the early 80s, I was introduced as a Black Northerner. And that notion that the Black Pig's Dyke actually was a dividing line between the north and south.
Really?
And it's so that in my psychic, it's always been we're a part of the Black North. And we've always been described like that for, you know, even during the conflict and troubles, I would say, universally, most people in the South would say, let them sort themselves out. We really don't want to have to deal with the North, you know, because we're not a part of it. And for so often within the psychic and culture here, we actually, a lot of people who grew up with a nationalist tradition like me, would have felt that the South abandoned us. And they didn't want us. So I think the Brexit conversation actually, I think, goes back much deeper than the current political discussion and debate. In reality, I was just watching TV there not the other day, and somebody in Dublin saying, well, we don't really want the North because it costs us too much. So it's now transferred, I think, from not only a cultural divide, you know, very firmly into a political and economic divide, but there is, and it's a question that we don't address and we don't deal with. You know, the crane bag in the early 80s intellectually tried to deal with that whole border thing. Field Day tried to deal with it, and others tried to deal with it, and try to re-engage that debate and that discussion as to why there is that fault line. Why there is a fault line between the North and the South. Because it exists, but we sort of, in one way, don't want to deal with it, and we're sort of pussyfooting around it with this idea of Brexit, with the assumption that all Northern Catholics want to be a part of the South of Ireland, and all Northern Unionists want to be a part of Britain, which is not quite true. There's another question that has to be asked about that fault line and how deep it goes and how far back it goes, and as to why, for me, it hasn't really disappeared that much. I'm just wondering what panelists think about that other fault line.
Well, I mean, I've seen working in England and Scotland. I mean, there is the fault line. The Black North thing is definitely true. I have there's friends here who talked about getting the cold hand down south whenever you say you're from the north, and it's like, don't bring the trouble down here. And there's a friend of mine's in the audience, he's a photographer. He did a project on the Dublin and Monaghan bombings and how that fault line became really entrenched after those bombings, where it was like people in the south said, right, enough's enough, you keep it up there. And that's a very interesting sort of crackling that I think people should pay attention to, that exact historical moment. But it works the opposite way too. I've seen a lot of people, unionists and loyalist backgrounds, go to England and Scotland and be treated like you're just another Paddy over here. And I've seen them, I've worked with people who've become friends of mine who are from totally the opposite side of the divide, and we're working together, and they're constantly, at the beginning, they're constantly emphasizing, no, actually, I'm British, I'm not Irish. And you see that fade away over time, and gradually, you realise one thing that they used to do, I worked in a bank for a while, and anybody from the north, they would go, he's from the north too, sit down next to him. And I would say, where are you from? And they would say, Portadown. Where are you from? Derry. And then we'd just sit like this. And then gradually, what broke the barriers down was kind of little things like, you miss Tato crisps. Aye, I do, aye. But it was actually sort of mild contempt for everyone else. It was that's what brought us together was, can you believe these English people, or can you believe these Scottish people? And you realise again that you have more in common. So the fault line exists definitely between the north and the south, but it exists in the Irish Sea as well. And really, I don't know, we're just condemned to be a sort of plural version of ourselves. The Whitman thing of you contain multitudes. Well, maybe we are British and Irish and Northern Irish and, on and on and on forever. Maybe we're cursed.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that, everyone. If you want to join us for the launch and a few drinks, that'd be great. Nathan's going to say a few words. At the launch? No? Are you? Maybe you're not?
I can just say, thanks to everybody for coming. And you hang around, there's copies of the launch available, or of the publication available outside, and there'll be a couple of drinks. I think that's all I need to say. But thanks to Mary, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you, everyone.